So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Fireside Chat with Dr. Jessica Clemens. My name is Jasmine Sadatman, and I'm a fourth-year resident in psychiatry here at Yale, as well as one of the Women's Mental Health Conference co-chairs. I couldn't be more thrilled and honored to host this chat with renowned psychiatrist, leader, and advocate, Dr. Jessica Clemens. Dr. Jessica Clemens, a board-certified psychiatrist, has been recognized by Forbes as a leader in making mental health and wellness a part of the current zeitgeist. Dr. Clemens received her medical degree from Weill Cornell Medical College of Cornell University and completed her residency training at New York University. While her work is primarily in providing direct clinical care, her mission is to reduce the stigma associated with mental illness. In addition, she recently released her first Audible original, Be Well, A Guide to Better Mental Health for All, which debuted as a part of the Audible Wellbeing Collection alongside Deepak Chopra. Her work in mental health advocacy consists of using social media, primarily Instagram via @AskDrJess, to host weekly live Q&A sessions to educate her following, as well as engage with them in real life events. Specifically, #BeWell, her community-based conversation series featuring prominent guests such as Swiss Beats, June Ambrose, and Kirby Jean Raymond, intended to inspire attendees and normalize conversations about mental health. Her efforts have gained national attention, including partnerships and appearances with brands and publications, including Forbes, Fast Company, Walmart, Samsung, Condé Nast, CNN, ABC News, Nike, Meta, HBO, Dove, Coca-Cola, Good Morning America, VH1, Essence, CVS, the New York City Department of Mental Health, the American Psychiatric Association, and several global brands. Before we begin the chat with our amazing guest speaker, I wanted to acknowledge our sponsors. Our Fireside Chat with Dr. Jessica Clemens is sponsored by Nema Health, a PTSD treatment center for women survivors of trauma in Connecticut. Founded by Dr. Sophia Nouri, a Yale-trained psychiatrist, Women's Mental Health Conference co-founder, and survivor herself, Nema offers intensive daily trauma therapy and uses cognitive processing therapy, a gold standard treatment for PTSD. Avia, a health platform focused on guiding members through their mental health journeys by providing technology, education, and community so that everyone can feel equipped to take control of their health. Candlelit Therapy, which offers digital therapeutics focused on the prevention of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders and preterm birth among Black, Latin, and Native birthing parents by increasing access to culturally affirming screening and cognitive behavioral therapy interventions at no cost. And Happy Feed, a mental health app focused on sharing positive memories and based on gratitude journaling and positive psychology. Both Candlelit Therapy and Happy Feed are hosting virtual booths within the Whova app, so be sure to stop in to hear more. Now, Dr. Jess, welcome, and thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning. Before we dive in, I just wanted to take a moment to ask if there's anything you'd like to share with us about your journey, including your path to the field of psychiatry and becoming a mental health advocate, or any of your recent work.
Wow, thank you so much for having me and for that introduction. It's always, I don't know, it takes me aback a bit to hear how much has happened in such a short time, because I'm still an early career psychiatrist. And I guess what I will share for anyone out there, who has, found themselves in psychiatry or mental health, we might be in the same boat, that it was really a mission or sort of a calling rather, because I did not intend to go into psychiatry, but I fell in love with it during medical school. And I really think the work that I've been able to do today really speaks to maybe why this field drew me in, because it's a field with a lot of opportunities. But I think when we think about being women and also coming from backgrounds that may be marginalized or underrepresented, there are opportunities for us to really speak truth to power and sort of give a voice to populations that need mental health treatment. So we'll kind of get into more of it, but I think, that's, I appreciate the introduction. I'm really honored to be here. This is such an exciting conference.
Thank you so much for saying that. That means so much coming from all of us as trainees, as students, as people who are really passionate about mental health. And I agree 100% with what you said. It is a calling, whether it's from lived experience of someone close to us, our own experience, and really it is a field where there's so much potential and so much opportunity to connect. And so thank you for sharing that. I always love hearing people's stories firsthand, and yours especially has been inspiring, hearing about all that you've done. So thank you for sharing that. I mean, on that note, Dr. Jess, you've done amazing work as a clinician advocate, and you have a strong presence across both new and traditional media. The way you use your platforms and voice has really been inspiring to me as a psychiatrist early in my career, and no doubt has inspired many of the students, trainees, and early career mental health providers and clinicians in our audience, many of whom studied and trained in the era of social media as you did. And I'm curious, at what point in your education and training did you realize that you wanted to engage with the community in traditional media platforms as well as through social media, in addition to your dedication to your clinical work?
Absolutely. So I think I'll start by saying, for me, my use of social media really was my own need to seek out a safe space. So I started using Instagram primarily. I had Facebook, everyone sort of had Facebook at some point. I had a Twitter account, but that was sort of what we'll kind of get into the differences, hopefully. But I started using Instagram when it, around like 2011. So this is when I was a medical student. And I found that it was just a space where I could go and sort of be myself, post little interesting pictures. I'm from Alabama and I was training in New York. So this was just an opportunity for me to show like my life in New York City, albeit most of the time was spent studying and in class, but, it would be nice to sort of cut to like a different part of town and show things there. So it was really a place that I just liked to enjoy using. It was a lot of pictures, very different than what it is today. So I was just sort of active in that way. And I would find even during medical school, when I would share like a photograph of myself studying in the stacks, for example, at the time, hashtags were very popular, where, you'd use the pound sign and then sort of write a word, and then people may find, you through that method. And so I was doing that, and I found that people who were interested in going into medical school would find my page and I could sort of tell my story. So for me, social media really just evolved as I did. So it started out as just something fun to do, something to show like pizza slices in New York City, things that were just sort of my everyday world, to, okay, people are actually interested in what it's like to be a medical student. And then it continued into my residency when I selected, psychiatry as the specialty I would go into. And that was a whole thing. And I found that people who sort of looked like me or came from backgrounds that maybe wouldn't find psychiatry to be a specialty that's like worth going to medical school and spending all that money and time for, I was able to sort of speak to that. So to your question, the turning point for me really came during my residency training. It was a very exciting but challenging program. So NYU, we cover many different hospitals. We had a lot of call. So it's just a time where isolation can sort of creep up for anyone, regardless of your background. So I would turn to social media when I was sort of, up all night and in between calls. I finished my notes on my patients. There was social media, so I pop on. And so what I found is that I was able to sort of build a community out of just sharing my experience. And then, as time went on, one of the exciting parts about our work, right, is we do a lot of education. So if you're thinking about the time when we're on like an inpatient unit and we're running groups, what I noticed is that I would run a group talking about medication, and I was expected to be able to answer, some of the, members who were there or patients who were there in the unit about like their questions about medication. So that sort of skill that we have naturally, I took it to social media. And at the time, around like 2018, one of the features that was really not kind of widely used, it's very widely used now, was Instagram Live, right? Where you, anyone who's not familiar, there's an option where you select live and it really gives you a live feed, just like how we're engaging now. And I asked a question before doing that: would anyone want to talk about anxiety with me? And there was an option to like poll your audience, which people can probably, who are familiar with Instagram, know about that feature. Many people said yes. I said, okay, if I go live at this time, would this work for you all? And people were like, yeah, I'll come on to it at this time. I think I picked like 12 noon on Saturday because that was a time when I'm not, working. And this was also my fourth year of medical school. Residency. So I do want to point out, in psychiatry, at least in my program, the fourth year is a bit of time where you have some elective time, we had less
Yes.
calls. So, you know, I had some flexibility. So nonetheless, I go live and there were like 200 people just sitting there ready to like talk about anxiety. And so that was really exciting, but it also spoke to some of the characteristics that maybe brought me to medicine. I love to teach. I love to be able to empower people with information that I'm learning, because I think that, you know, that gives people the power to be able to make decisions, right? When they are facing, how do I treat my anxiety disorder, right? I want people to be informed. And it just kept going from there. Admittedly, I did have a champion in my corner, my husband, who was really encouraging, like, this is really interesting. He's not in medicine. I'm sort of a completely opposite world, but he really saw that there was something there. And he would encourage me, like, you should keep doing this. Like, don't just do it once. And it sort of continued from there. So I know I'm kind of getting a little bit sort of away from the question to a degree, but for me, it really just, it was something that I was really pulled to do, because again, a lot of it stemmed from isolation with our busy call schedule, but also just a need. I felt like I wasn't really seeing people at the time talk about mental health or mental illness. And it just, you know, my community sort of drove the conversation, and I allowed them to do that. And I felt comfortable, even though it was uncharted territory. I felt comfortable doing it, because I knew that when I was going to do these talks, that the focus would just be on the information and not really on giving people these little sort of nuanced examples of what anxiety could be like, but just a general DSM. Here's what we know about it. Here's what I've experienced caring for people, and just kind of took it from there.
Right. That's amazing. And I really appreciated how you mentioned that it's part of the skill set and part of the training in psychiatry, this psychoeducation piece, but really seems like, as you said, that your own draw to find community is what kind of propelled you into this space where you built an even bigger community, which is amazing. And having a champion in your corner, I can say from my experience, I mean, this process of going into medicine, going into your residency training, no matter where we go with our training and our career, having those champions, it's just so key. So thank you for sharing that. And truly, it's really encouraging and motivating to hear that evolution of how things progressed, especially since many of us who are early in our careers are still discovering the different ways that we can use our voices. And I know we touched upon this a little bit, but you know, social media and traditional media outlets really can represent an important potential platform for community, for education, for advocacy, for breaking down stigmas and barriers. So I'm curious, what advice do you have when it comes to strategies for healthily engaging publicly as clinicians, as advocates in any of these spaces?
Absolutely. I think I'll kind of think about this in two ways. You know, social media is its own sort of ecosystem. There really are no rules, so to speak. To your point about my work also in traditional media. Traditional media really does have its own frame that they follow. They really, you know, have very short segments. They often will give the expectation around what the conversation will be about. They don't lead necessarily with what they want from the conversation, but it's very focused, time limited, and you're not the one sort of dictating where the conversation goes. You're often being interviewed. And then usually in those settings, the opportunities they seek out. So I would get emails through my website or contacted through social media from a producer about, we have a segment we would love for you to be a part of. So traditional media is a little bit different, but I think if you do have opportunities to be a part of that, we'll get back to social media part, but you definitely want to sort of be aware of what you can bring to the conversation. And you don't always have to say yes. Like I'll have people say, you know, can you speak to this sort of nuanced topic? And if I don't feel comfortable, you know, I'll kindly decline and just say, keep me in mind for these things. And I'll remind them of the areas that I do feel comfortable sort of being, you know, a figure to talk about things. And I found that a lot during COVID and some of the controversial topics that came up. You know, I would decline. And so I do want to kind of emphasize that when you're navigating this space, if this is something that you're interested in, it's absolutely okay to say no. I think that's something we're all sort of talking about a lot now, right?
Yes.
Like put those boundaries up. Don't, you know, no is a sentence. You can use it, period. That's it. So
Yes.
keep that in mind when you are navigating the space. So, but what I do like about traditional media it's a well-driven sort of
Mhm.
well-oiled machine. They've already got things figured out, and you just sort of pop in, and it's an exciting experience as well. Social media is completely different, right?
Mhm.
There are no rules. You can post something and it could harm you, your career. It
Yes.
also could really turn into something really wonderful, which is what I've experienced in mine. So my best practice is really start with thinking about which platform you identify with. There's so many, but I think the biggest ones are like Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and then there's a few sort of audio only
Mhm.
platforms that have come about, like Clubhouse is one of them. If you're already sort of a user in these spaces, great. Pay attention to sort of what rooms make you feel uncomfortable or what content makes you feel
Mhm.
uncomfortable. Pay attention to what you gravitate to,
Yes.
right? And so I think just learning the ecosystem of whatever platform that you're drawn to is important. I don't think people have to be on everything.
Mhm.
I do have my sort of username saved on a couple spaces because of all
Mhm.
the work that I put into sort of
Yes.
building it, that, I don't want someone to go on a new platform and then they have my username, and
Mhm.
I want people to feel like if they find that name they know it's my content, but I don't
Exactly.
actually engage on all of them. Like,
Mhm.
I'm not on TikTok. I just feel like I just can't do that.
Yes.
But nothing against people who can. So again, I guess the message I'm giving here is just know the ecosystem that you're going to engage in. And then one of the things that helped me very early on, I wish I had it here with me, but I kept a journal that I would literally write out what the mission, what my goal is, and was at the time for the work that I'm doing. And that sort of helped me to keep myself really in line with like what it is I'm doing, because there will be things that will pull you away. Social media now has so many brands that are,
Mhm.
sort of seeking people out. And I do some influencing work now, but I'm like out of residency and all of that. But
Mhm.
that's even something to be aware of. And I do see medical students and sometimes residents even getting drawn into like these different influencing opportunities where brands are either sending um, product or payment. So you have to really know what your goal is and try your best to stick with it. So for me, it was always about destigmatizing, and then it evolved to normalizing conversations about mental health. So I think if you are going to spend time in social media, it's important that you set your own frame, right? Which is different than the traditional media where the frame is there. So it feels safer to know sort of what to expect. But social media, there is no frame. So you have to really think about that. And I guess the last piece I'll say is when you are engaging in this space, really think about this as an opportunity to speak to those groups that maybe you identify with yourself,
Mhm.
or maybe an area of interest that you may have within, your sort of professional goals. Maybe you really love to speak to women's mental health. You can sort of carve that out. There's some incredible people who are doing that work on social media as well, and they're sort of just showing people, in the public,
Mhm.
examples of what they do every single day. So you can think about that. You can also think about if you want to provide something that you may have wanted, if you have
Mhm.
your own sort of mental health journey.
Mhm.
There are a lot of opportunities for that in social media. And I think for me, it started out with wanting to give
Yes.
voices to marginalized groups, because at the
Yes.
time I was feeling a little disempowered and like I didn't really have a voice. I know many residents go through that. So
Mhm.
a lot of my efforts were just spent, how can I provide a voice and a space and in a language that people can relate to, and just continue with that. And I think it's important that you don't pay attention to the numbers,
Mhm.
like follower count. I think today's platforms, there's so many people on these platforms now. It may be harder to grow it in the same way that I maybe could have when I started out in 2018.
Mhm.
It's possible, but I think if you're focusing on just what feels right for you, there will be people who find value in that, and it may follow you throughout your career. If you go into private practice,
Mhm.
you may already have sort of laid the framework for what people can expect from you. um, these are just some things that I'm kind of thinking through as we speak. But I think with social media, you just really have to be very, very secure with whatever frame you are setting and
Mhm.
doing your best to stick to it, because there's so many things that evolve and change.
Right.
It's unreal how much it's changed in the few years that I've been engaging with it in this sort of tool that I'm using it for mental health advocacy. it's a lot has changed for it.
Absolutely. No, that's so many pearls in your answer. And, a couple of things that really struck me were, kind of fleshing out the difference between like the frame, the structure of the traditional versus social media platforms. That's something that maybe a lot of us who are newer to this space might not fully appreciate, and both come with their pros and cons. And then just as you were speaking, I mean, it's so clear that you're a brilliant psychiatrist and therapist. Like a lot of it was, very much rooted in mindfulness, awareness, like know what your boundaries are, know what space you want to belong in and what space you want to represent, and bringing that with you. And just given that so many of us in the conference committee, as well as in the audience, are trainees and students, I think that was also very helpful advice to just think from a professional standpoint, that being a student versus a resident might have a different kind of context in terms of being a public facing person versus someone who's practicing on their own. And I think that's helpful to keep in mind as well. But
I think
yes,
if I could add one piece to that,
yes,
I mean, it just,
please.
as you're sharing that, it does make me think about sort of where things evolve for me. And I know that there may be programs, particularly thinking about, medical students or residents or, trainees and other mental health programs, that you do want to be thoughtful about what it is that your program expects. When I started using social media in this way, there really weren't any sort of ground rules or understanding from when I think about the perspective of like my program directors, right? People really weren't doing it. So I think I was able to engage with it a little bit more freely, but again, very much rooted in all of the sort of ethical practices that we learned, during our training. So a lot of it was really driven by that, but I was out there a little bit on my own. And in fact, I would have attending sort of come to me and say, "Oh, I noticed this, like, can you give me some tips?" Right. So I know the landscape has really, I think, shifted a bit. So I would encourage people to keep that in mind and be aware of, there may be some programs who have a strict sort of expectation around what their students or trainees may do on social media. And I don't think you should disregard that during this time, because it is an important time to learn. It's an important time to focus on getting, the experience through patient care. But if you're going to dabble a bit, I would say really keep your ears open to what your program expects of you. Because I want to reassure people, if mine had any sort of, it just did not feel comfortable with things that I maybe were doing or engaging in that way, I would certainly have pulled back a bit, because for me, the most important thing was to complete training so that I could do the work that, I'm here to do. So I do want to make that sort of note. And even when you're an attending, if you're working for some organizations, they may have a sort of strict policy around how people are engaging, now that so many people are. So not to sort of rain on the parade of like, let's get out there and do this work, but it is something to kind of think about as you do decide to navigate it, because it's still so uncharted that you really have to be thoughtful as you engage.
Yes. And absolutely, Dr. Jess, to your to what we were speaking about earlier, in very many ways, you were and are a trailblazer, and keeping in mind the changing landscape is kind of part of that. You have to know what the trail is, so to speak. So I actually think that that was very on point, and I think a really important thing to consider, because most of us are in this first and foremost to do the clinical work, and we're trying to find these other ways that we can advocate, that we can communicate, that we can expand the good that we can do, but we want to do it in a way that's healthy, a way that's safe, a way that maintains professionalism, and just keeping all of that in mind. So I think that was really, really helpful and timely advice to keep in mind as well. But really, on a related note, I mean, something that I have been thinking about a lot and would love to get your thoughts on is, this idea of being an advocate for mental health through public platforms in general, and then social media in particular. For many of kind of these public facing individuals, part of what connects them with their communities, their audience, so to speak, is this degree of vulnerability, of self-disclosure, of openness that really resonates with people. And I can say, as you know, an early career psychiatrist, I often think about how to find the right balance between self-disclosure and professional or therapeutic distance. And this is even in, you know, professional and clinical spaces at times. But really, I found this to be even more of a complex and nuanced, you know, balance to achieve when it comes to social media and other public platforms. And would really love to hear more about how you, as a psychiatrist in these spaces, have navigated these issues, this vulnerability, the self-disclosure, the openness in a profession, you know, maybe medicine in general, possibly even, you know, psychiatry and the other kind of mental health allied professions in particular, where we are often taught to be limited and even cautious in how much we disclose with patients, with colleagues. I'm just curious to hear how you've balanced that.
I love this question because, again, it's something that we all should think about as we do put ourselves into these sort of public facing roles. For me, one thing that I sort of think about with self-disclosure is when I walk in the room and someone is expecting a different psychiatrist, someone who maybe comes from a background that doesn't look like mine, you know, I sort of think about that is, you know, this is the disclosure. There is an elephant in the room, so to speak. If anyone was not expecting their psychiatrist to be like a Black woman who has like an afro,
right,
or, you know, big curly hair. So what I agree with this thought around what do we disclose, but I do think that for many of us, that same sort of, I guess, emphasis around disclosure, it's really not possible. I think there are going to be things that come up. For example, if I'm caring for someone who is from a different racial ethnic background, there may be a point when we end up talking about race, right? And I wonder if they were with someone from the same racial ethnic background, would that come up in the same way, where we are now talking about the differences, perhaps if I'm thinking about in session. So I'm trying to get to the point here, but for me, it wasn't something I was so afraid of. I wasn't so afraid of, am I going to disclose so much? Because I think I always felt like when I entered into the room, because psychiatry does not have a lot of Black psychiatrists, that there was already something that people were going to be thinking about, whether it's an exciting feeling where I've had some patients and their families say, I'm so excited that, you know, my son is being cared for by a Black woman, you know,
yes.
or, you know, patients themselves telling me like, oh my gosh, I sighed when I saw you. So these are things that are in the room. And I think one of the things that I personally love about our work in therapy is that there's opportunities for us to grow through meaningful connection. And so I think about my own experience in therapy and how it was the times when my therapist wouldn't disclose things about himself, but would allow us to really be vulnerable together about maybe if it was an emotion I brought up, you know, from him, we could talk about that. And so I think when I think about social media and vulnerability, I'm not being vulnerable for the sake of just sharing things because I think it will invite people in. What I do share is something that I hope will give people food for thought. It will, you know, encourage someone to pursue medicine, pursue psychiatry, because they hear me being open about my experience and finding that, you know, I'm not being shunned away from the field if I share that I felt isolated. I felt, you know, alone in some ways because of aspects of my identity. So I think we have to definitely think about disclosure, but also bear in mind where there are opportunities, again, focusing on whatever community or niche that you think you want to engage with, how can this help them? And so again, I think we even think about that when we're caring for patients, right? If we have a therapy case and, you know, your patient has been sort of struggling with something, you may not give details about your own personal experience, but you may give them an example of how you do have a closer connection to something that they're sharing, and that might invite them to share more. So when we think about disclosure, you do want to think about how is this going to help? And so a lot of what I shared was driven through that. But I will add this, for me, because of my social media evolution started with it being a personal account, and my husband has this like really cool sort of access to people because of his background. A lot of people were following me because of the things I would share in terms of like lifestyle and the proximity to certain influential people. but now that I'm a mother, I think about this even more because I do think about having a child and what I do want to share or not share about him on social media. So it's constantly evolving. I think you want to be comfortable with the aspects that you do feel comfortable sharing. Feel free to share it. And if there are things that you don't, you don't. And for me right now, it's I don't overshare a lot about my child because I think about his footprint and sort of I want him to be able to have consent and not just open up, social media 16 years from now and be like, oh my God, you posted every single thing that I ever did. So we have to think a lot about that. And so I think if you go back to what I shared in the beginning, if you really take that time to carve out your mission, sort of what your value set is going to be, go back to it. And I promise you, I carried this notebook around with me all the time. I filled it with ideas, but I also went back to like what's important. And for me, it was the message, but I also knew that people really appreciated the messenger, so to speak. So I would give them a little bit of me through my language, through my hand use, through sort of being real in that way. So I think there are ways to disclose without overdoing it.
Absolutely.
I hope that sort of made sense. I feel like
it
I
makes
went on and on.
sense. No, well, I love hearing you go on and on. So I think this is what our audience is here for. They're not here for me. They're here for Dr. Jess. But truly, so many things really stood out. I think one big piece that is a part of my therapy training, as well as a lot of therapists in the audience, is self-disclosure can be therapeutic, and naming what's in the room. You're absolutely right. We're not really ever, it doesn't necessarily make sense, and it might not always even be a good thing to have only treat patients who have similar lived experience, identities as yourself. And so I can say for myself that I'm still growing and learning as a therapist, but the self-disclosure, being an Iranian American woman, my parents were immigrants, like there are so many, and being a younger woman, there are so many things that are in the room, whether or not you name it. So thinking about how to do that therapeutically, whether it's with a patient in front of you in the office or in your social media or other kind of communities and networks, I really appreciated your advice that just being thoughtful about the purpose of it, like what does it stand for? And then going further upstream, knowing the answer to that comes from knowing your own personal mission statement, so to speak. And by the way, I love that you had a physical, we're talking like a physical notebook, right? Like I love that. There's something therapeutic, even though we're talking so much about these like digital and public spaces, there's something really therapeutic about having something written down to remind yourself of, and like a physical embodiment of your mission, your values, which I just think that's really beautiful.
Absolutely. It just, for me, it was something to come back to, because again, this space can really pull you in a lot of directions. And, if you find yourself, because we all are, if you're going to use social media to create content is the term that's used now, but to create anything for an audience or community, you also are engaging with it. And there's times I've been sucked in where I felt like I'm not posting enough, or maybe I should change how I'm posting. Maybe I need to do this. But that tangible notebook is something that I'm like, I wrote this at a time when this wasn't what it is today, when it wasn't about, what brand is going to reach out, or I want to, have an opportunity to speak on XYZ platform. It was really at a time when I just wanted to find my voice and use it. So I would encourage it. Pull out, we have so much that we're doing electronically already. Pull out a pen and pad, make it super cute if that's your thing, or not, whatever. But for me, I just enjoyed having it where I could just brainstorm, but I could come back to it and remind myself, Jessica, this is why you're here. And if it doesn't feel right, this is why you started it. And that the reason I started it, and I think adhering to that mission is how it's been able to grow, because I'm very clear about what it is I'm trying to do.
I love that. And so much of what you say is kind of the underlying message, is like this idea of balance. And it's really amazing to hear how you've been able to strike this balance, how you're continuing to work on, what does the balance look like? Speaking for myself, and I'm sure many in our audience, I'm really feeling empowered to keep working towards this balancing all of these different pieces. But, we've talked about social media and just kind of transitioning into thinking about social media as it relates not only to clinicians and advocates, but also the general population. In many ways, social media promises connection and community that can extend on a global scale in ways that we weren't really able to achieve in the pre-social media era. But as we know, especially those of us who are mental health practitioners, when it comes to social media and mental health, there's also the potential for unintended mental health impacts that can come with engaging in these spaces. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts? What are your suggestions even for how we can navigate social media while preserving our own mental health, especially as clinicians and advocates?
Absolutely. So I think, when I prepare to answer this question, I'm really speaking to people who are using this space for advocacy work. Obviously, if you're using it as a user and you're sort of just taking in content, the solution is always just find a way to take a break from it. I periodically will delete certain apps. I find Twitter to be a very sort of dangerous space personally, because there's so many thoughts coming at you. And a lot of times the thoughts that come forward or sort of get a number of like retweets, which means when people sort of hit that they want a button to make it show up in their timeline, or they like it. So those that rise to the top, I think often are very controversial, and you might even want to respond. So for me, if I'm a user more so on a platform, I'll just log off. I'll just delete the app periodically and say, you know what, I'm feeling the urge, back to your mindfulness point, I'm feeling the urge to really engage in something that could be harmful. Let me just delete the app for a bit. And let whatever the sort of public conversation is about this topic go. Like, I don't have to actually use my voice in every conversation. And that's hard. I have a lot of opinions and I like to use them, but I have to be thoughtful. But for anyone who is using this in the way that I have, like when I think about my Instagram, is, my advice is to really pay attention to how it makes you feel. I was alluding to this before, that for me right now, Instagram is just not what it used to be. It was a space where I felt like it was a lot about community. The content wasn't so it wasn't so quick, and it wasn't so evolving. It was just a lot of stagnant posts of like a photograph, and then you could write a caption, and that's really where I would like show my stuff. I would like write these really engaging captions and try to get people to sort of share, and they wouldn't. It wasn't sharing like your mental health experience, but share if you can relate to this topic, or share how you manage stress. Like it wasn't share your story about how you're managing bipolar disorder. I don't encourage that, but it was a way to sort of get people to share their experience and just see that this is a community. And that's what my Instagram lives also really centered on. We're going to talk about a topic. Here's the frame. I would give them 3 rules that I sort of wanted people to think about. This is important that you remember, it's the internet. Whatever you say here is not just going to stay here. Kind of keep in mind that we should keep our discussion to this topic, and it's not therapy. If you have any issues that come up for you, please talk to your doctor. That was always sort of what I would frame it as, but it was still about community. So if you are using it in this way and you find that you're getting drawn in and you feel like it's making things worse, you feel more anxious, that's sort of where I am now. And what I found is that I'm just not as comfortable engaging with it as much anymore, frankly. A lot of the content is a lot more content driven. So there's an algorithm now where you almost have to post every single day to sort of get the same visibility. There's a sort of a push for more of these short videos. On Instagram, it's called Reels. Right. And these can be really beautiful. I mean, I find myself getting into some, like, people will show their different lifestyle videos, and they show like a year's worth of photos in 15 seconds. Right. And for me, I'm like, that's just, I don't want to summarize my life for people in just that short way. So I think it's just important to pay attention to how it makes you feel. And for me right now, it's not making me feel that great. It's not really giving that same sort of feeling of community that it did before, where I would know some of the followers because they would engage a lot. I wouldn't know them personally, but then it would translate into a lot of the in real life events I did, like Be Well, where we get to meet people and they would share like, I'm a medical student and I want to go into psychiatry now. I mean, that was when it really translated into these real opportunities to help. And also, I think I'm getting away from the question a bit, but also, when I think about how many people would reach out and say that they were interested in going to medical school. And I shared my own experience of doing a post-baccalaureate program. And then to hear back that people were able to get into the same program and now they're medical students, right? That was to me what I would get the most gratification from. Or your Instagram live that you did on anxiety helped me to actually start talking to my doctor about some of the symptoms I've been wondering about, or getting stopped on the subway in New York and someone sharing that they heard an interview and they started to talk to their family about their experience in therapy, and then learning that their parents were in therapy. So it was a lot more of that. And I haven't been able to experience that as much. And I think that also contributed to my own dissatisfaction with it. But we also have been living in a virtual sort of experience world.
Yes.
We're not living in an experience, but a lot of our connections are all virtual because of the pandemic. So I think that also framed it. So I think I need to get back to the question here. But I think the main thing I would just say is my advice is just really pay attention to how you feel, take the breaks, and then don't feel compelled to change what you are doing because the landscape of whatever platform you are using has changed. That's not easy. I'm personally struggling with that because I do feel that people are expecting me to provide sort of this voice in a space that's changed. And the way that I typically provide that voice or engage is also not a way that is really being supported right now by the platform. The platform wants to see more of these short videos. And I'm a mother, I work full-time at an amazing clinic that's doing a lot of work for marginalized groups. I just don't have the time to do it. So, I think going back to part of what we talked about earlier, it's really just important to know your why.
Yes.
And take a seat sometimes. And so I've been feeling a little bit of that personally in my use of social media.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking of self-disclosure and vulnerability for a greater,
I didn't know I was going to do that.
No, that is so meaningful to hear. I really appreciate that honesty. I really appreciate that vulnerability. And honestly, these are words to live by. And again, this theme of balance comes back. It's such an important one, and really increasingly something that our generation is really aware of and prioritizing. And we do have to, especially given the work that we do, we really do have to be mindful of our own boundaries, our own mental health, and our why. I just really love that being true to your why. And, really, I would love to transition, speaking of your work, I would love to transition to talking about some of the incredible work you've done. Early in your career, you were selected to provide the first live televised therapy session on VH1, In Session Live with Dr. Jess, which I had the opportunity to watch a recording of. It was a powerful interaction, a powerful dynamic to watch. And I can only imagine that it was even more so for the people who had the opportunity to watch it live. Could you please tell us what it was like for you to be a central part of this historic moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I have not been able to personally go back and watch it. I really have trouble going back and watching anything that I shared. So I appreciate your taking the time to check it out. It was an opportunity that really presented itself again when I think I was in this really white hot space. I was getting a lot of interviews, like CNN International was just like, what is going on? There's a psychiatrist who's using social media. So I got to talk about that. I was getting featured on ABC News. There was just a lot of features because at the time no one was doing it. And so that's how I was sort of discovered by the person who ultimately wanted to do this was the person that I was doing this therapy session with. And he goes by sort of he has a nationally syndicated radio show called The Breakfast Club. And I got to sort of be on that before doing this with him once we had sort of met and he shared what it was that he wanted to do. So his name is Charlemagne. That's what he goes by. And he personally was touched by his own experience with therapy and obviously has this longstanding career in media and all of these connections already. But when his team came to me, they shared that he wanted to do a therapy session. He was apparently just going to do it like on a social media platform, but his team said, no, I think we could do this on one of the major, networks. And VH1 was the one that ultimately wanted to take part in that. He shared with me that they wanted to use their own in-house media doctor. So when I share that, I mean, we think about some of the, MTV doctors of the past.
Yes.
I'm gonna age myself, but like Dr. Drew, all of these people who typically are the doctors that they use. But he said, no, I really would like it to be with a person of color, Black woman.
Yes.
And there I was at this time where I was just doing my lives weekly and just having a good time. And I was approached to do this. I was terrified because I'm still learning therapy, but it's very much an important part of the work that we do. And I
Yes.
love that I get to, practice both medication management, but therapy. I absolutely love the work. But I was terrified. I said, oh my God, I'm not even like, you sure you don't want to find someone who's seasoned, like someone who has way more that they could provide? I mean, and I'm like, I'm going to be honest with you. It's probably not going to be that exciting because therapy really is not that exciting. It's not what you get from television, right? People watch shows, right? When they're watching these shows, they want action. They want, a lot of things going on. And he's like, no, I want it to be the real thing because his mission, also very focused, is I want people to know that this is something that we should do, especially Black men, not especially Black men, but he wanted to speak to that audience specifically, that let's just show it. And I don't care if it's boring, I just want to do that. So he was very comfortable putting himself out there when there were things that came up in the session. I think that surprised him. The actual experience was incredible and went really quickly. It was very interesting to do it under these really bright lights, but I had like my family there with me, and on the commercial breaks, they would come and like give me the water and like, this is going well. And I'm like, I hope he's okay and comfortable. But it just was something. I think that at the end of the 1 hour segment, we did what we came to do, which was really to ultimately show what a session can look like. And for anyone who thought that it was going to be this, messy sort of experience, who maybe felt frightened about therapy because they saw something on a television show that made it really this very uncomfortable experience to even imagine, let alone engage with, they saw that, look, your therapist can actually look like you, or your therapist can actually allow you the space to sort of talk, and you're going to, summarize things and go home for the day. That's not so bad. So I got a lot of feedback from people who were like, I think I'm going to, start seeing a therapist now, from populations that typically would not. So that was really, I think at the end of the day, it helped me to feel comfortable with the decision I made to do it. But I was a little nervous because it was at a time when my residency training was sort of wrapping up, and I did make a decision that I felt like it was worth me giving that sort of leap of faith and trusting that the experience would go okay. And they, of course, did a lot of disclosures. They were very careful not to call it a therapy session in the title, but it essentially was a session. And the feedback we even heard from VH1 was that this was probably one of the most positive shows that they ever did.
That's
and that it was something that they were glad that they were a part of. So it was a great experience to take part in.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for sharing that. I thought it was amazing to watch. I can imagine, like you said, seeing a therapy session like this in real time really made people curious about, or open to the thought of therapy, what it could be like to see a therapist or psychiatrist, what a therapist or psychiatrist could look like, what a patient could look like, and hopefully spark more conversations about mental health. I mean, it just really shows how much of what you've dedicated your career to has been this breaking down of the stigmas, normalizing conversations about mental health. And, especially given the wide reach of people who could watch the session, taking into account people like myself who viewed it after the fact. I know I wish we could just keep talking. I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but just on the topic of your advocacy and dedication to the field, Dr. Jess, you've done so much for the field and the communities you serve. Your work in the public arena has been extensive. It's been impactful. We've talked about a lot of it already, but I'm curious, as you continue in your career and the ongoing advocacy work that you do, how do you envision using your voice, using your platforms, using your skills and your connection to the communities you serve in the years to come as you continue to work to break down the stigmas associated with mental health diagnosis and treatment?
Absolutely. I think for me, I'm getting more and more comfortable with just allowing this to be a dynamic process. Again, that mission is still there. It's something I go back to. It's what I reference. It's the anchor, so to speak. But I am getting comfortable with allowing my career to sort of develop as these platforms develop, as the sort of interest in these platforms changes, people might, I know there's Meta that's coming, and I know they're expecting us to spend way more time, which is concerning. And I don't know if I actually would want to invest my time in that. But I think right now, what I'm most interested in right now is really continuing to build my skills as a clinician. I will always work for and care for people who are a part of marginalized backgrounds, every background, obviously, but I really want to be sure that I'm available and dedicated to that practice. And then, I'm a mother now, so I do think about a lot of what we all are thinking about is young people and how they are experiencing a lot of mental health symptoms. There was a whole New York Times piece, right, that really sort of brought that to the public arena and discussions there. We've been talking about it, I think, internally, but so I wonder if there are ways that I can lend my voice to that community, particularly because I do think there are things that I can, people may still find relatable within like sort of the adolescent sort of younger population about things that they may see in my world. And I do hope to be able to provide a voice and a space to really hear from them, because they are sort of the high users of social media. They are growing in a time where their cafeteria is not just the space that they're physically in, but it's going to be whoever they're following on social media. And the cafeteria was a scary place for me.
I know, right?
Right. So I
don't even want to think about it right now.
Right. Like just, can I get through this period without anyone saying something, to me? But I really think about young people. So I do think a lot of my work may shift there. And then obviously, women's mental health is a big part of a lot of the work I do. I had an opportunity to do like a mini fellowship at NYU. We didn't get a fellow one year. And so they gave me the opportunity to fill a lot of that person's role. So I think there's so much that we can do there. So back to the point and the question, I'm just allowing myself to follow my interests. And if it means, putting social media down a bit, that's fine. I'm actually really interested in writing a little bit more, particularly some longer form content. There's platforms like Medium where you can share. And I think personally, I like the idea of these smaller ecosystems where you actually can hear from people, like, and know this is what they appreciate. But when it gets really large, it is hard to know what's really resonating with the community that you're building. So I'm just going to allow myself to follow it, grow. And if it ultimately means this was it, and I did my part in sort of shaking things up and encouraging people to pick up the torch and let's, continue to engage and advocate, then great. I appreciate it, being here and getting that opportunity to do something that came from a place of need, and watching it bloom is just amazing. So just going to let it go wherever it goes.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. And in many ways, it sounds like a full circle moment. You're going back to that community and you're going back to that space. Dr. Jess, thank you so much for sharing your time, your wisdom, your encouragement with us today. It's really been a dream come true to have the opportunity to speak and connect with you. I hope to stay connected in the future. Thank you so much for being a part of our conference and for all that you do.
Thank you. And thank you, for people who took the time to be here with us on a Saturday. I know it's just, and again, I really appreciate everything that you all are doing with this conference, and I cannot wait to see where it goes, right? You plant that seed and it just grows. So, much success to you all. And I'm also available for anyone who, would like to stay in touch. I'm on social media, but also I would love to stay connected with you in your journey as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jess. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. We are so thankful for your presence. Our next events are our concurrent sessions for the afternoon, which can be accessed through a separate link within Whova. I hope to see you there, and thank you again.